Hi, you are live with Lila and
Vanessa Druskett.
hi, Vanessa Druskett. I am so happy that you're here. This is very exciting for me.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Lila. I'm thrilled to be here, thrilled to be meeting your audience, and have lots of great stuff to share today.
I think a lot of the people here are here for you. I know that they've heard about what we're talking about today, creating inclusive cultures with team emotional intelligence. And this episode is sponsored by ERS, so I know we have a lot of ERS, Educational Resource Systems fans here as well. As they come in, they might be commenting and having their own conversations in the chat, because what we have to say is it's like as old as trees and as new as a sprout. So it's going to be exciting.
Absolutely.
Looking
Great.
forward to talking about this. To just welcome some people who are joining us for the replay or who have just seen this pop up in your feed and you're not even sure what you're seeing. We're going to be discussing team emotional intelligence as a way of creating inclusive cultures, setting expectations way ahead of time so that by the end of this episode, you should be able to, if you've paid attention, you should be able to assess the emotional intelligence of your own team, not just the team members, but the whole team itself. And also identify where some new norms or what you might call habits or expectations could be helpful in some situations that will probably sound pretty familiar to you. We're going to first define what team emotional intelligence is in the context of what is that versus what we already know about. Emotional intelligence, social intelligence. What is the difference between those things and team emotional intelligence? And then we're going to be referencing 3 case studies, which are all true stories provided to us by ERS, and getting feedback from you, Vanessa, about how team emotional intelligence could have helped in each of these different cases. We'll call out some of the red flags that people might recognize in their own teams and what could have been done to avoid them. And then at the end, if we have some time left after our amazingly rich discussion, we'll take Q&A from the audience. If we're not able to get to your questions with sufficient answers during this episode, please reach out to Vanessa. And now I have to tell you who she is, because she's one of the most impressive guests that I have had, not just in her research, but in her ability to connect information about sort of a hazy new topic about something that's as old as time, human behavior. So Vanessa Druskett, PhD, is our subject matter expert on team emotional intelligence. She is a researcher. She is an associate professor at University of New Hampshire. She's research director at Legacy Teams, and she's an academic partner of our episode sponsor, ERS, Educational Resource Systems. You'll see them down at the bottom of our screen. So Vanessa, I don't know where you find the time for all of this, but you are very impressive. And so if that was enough, the intro, and people just want to go and work with you right now, where's the best place for them to find you and follow your work?
Absolutely. Well, first, let me thank you for that great intro, Lila. I appreciate that. Best place to find me really is on LinkedIn. You can also go to the University of New Hampshire site where I have a website, but you can also go to educationalresources.com because I'm an academic partner there, or Legacy Teams. I'm the research director there. So I would love to have you contact me if you have any questions that come up through this discussion. And I hope there are some questions.
Yeah, I'm sure
Thanks,
there will be. Yeah, because this is such an exciting conversation. And I'll just restate that website for those of you who missed it, educationalresource.com. And you can always Google this thing down here, Educational Resource Systems, ERS. They're our episode sponsor. And Vanessa Druskett works with them as a research associate and academic partner. So now that we know who you are and where to find you, let's get into it. So would you please share with me and our audience, what is the difference between team emotional intelligence and what we already know to be emotional and social intelligence. What is the difference here?
Okay. So let me first refresh your memory on what is emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is about using emotion as data. We have known for decades now, but it's really coming into fruition in the last, I'd say in the last 10 years, through lots of brain research, that human beings are really emotional people. Emotion drives everything we do. We feel emotion acutely. And if we want to motivate people at work, if we want to really understand one another, we have to think about each other as emotional beings. So, people with emotional intelligence basically are aware of their own emotions and how that impacts others. So, if I'm in a bad mood, I know how that impacts you. They're aware of others' emotions. So, I'm really tuning into you, not just what you're saying, but your emotions. I'm also managing my emotions. So, let me give you an example. Of course, it's a little bit nerve-wracking here, being interviewed by Lila, who's so articulate. And so to manage that emotion, what I try to do is I try to turn it into excitement. I try to label it as excitement rather than nervousness. That's a way of managing your emotions. So that's something that emotionally intelligent people do. Well, teams actually are systems. So being an emotionally intelligent person in a team is useful. But systems, that's a fancy way of saying that basically teams are really about interactions. And so everything in a team is an interaction. And the way I'm interacting with someone affects everyone in the entire team. And it's a web of interactions. And so team emotional intelligence is about creating habits, rules, we call them norms, about how we're going to interact with one another. And through my research, I've been studying teams for 25 years. My colleagues and I have come up with 3 buckets of habits, 3 buckets of norms that create an emotionally intelligent team. The first bucket is about how we treat one another, because we have very specific emotional needs when we're in a team. Turns out that we've been living in tribes for 5 million years. So evolution has favored people who can really think about emotions and feel emotions as information in a team. And so the way you treat me sends me information, and the way I treat you sends you information. And so how we treat one another in all of those interactions makes a difference in a team. Second bucket is about how we learn and work together. So there's a lot of brain power in a team. We don't want to just hear from 1 or 2 people. We want to hear from everyone. We want to be able to think together in a team. So that bucket of norms is about how we're going to operate and work together. And then the third bucket of norms is about how we treat our stakeholders. Because as we know, no team is an island. Teams have clients. Teams work with other teams. Teams have bosses. And those stakeholders also have emotional worlds. And so if the team is cognizant and aware of the stakeholders' emotions, it's a much more emotionally intelligent team overall, better collaborator, more resilient, especially something that's important, especially right now during our pandemic, and really more effective. I've been studying this for 25 years, and it's very clear that when you're an emotionally intelligent team, you're better overall. So hopefully that explains to you what it is. I'm looking forward to hearing your case studies, and we'll apply this model to some real life case studies from ERS. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much for that very clear definition. I think that people who are brand new to this team emotional intelligence thing couldn't possibly have any questions, but if you do, please drop them in the comments, and hopefully we will address them with the rest of this episode. So you brought it up, but I'm just going to remind our audience that we are going to be looking at 3 case studies provided by ERS, Educational Resource Systems. They are our episode sponsor, and they have also gone above and beyond to give us real life, real business stories, which, as you know, are the point of Live with Lila, to examine the role of intentional communication, and in this case, team emotional intelligence and its role in creating some predictability. So our first case study is what I'm calling forced to fail. This is something that if you have worked in corporate for any amount of time, especially in pharma, where there are high stakes for how we measure our performance, how we deliver material, and sometimes that goalpost keeps changing. That's just something that may come up, right? Like that's just something that we should be able to expect. And so what happened in this particular case that we're calling forced to fail is there was, here's the issue, marketing and sales and training had all agreed upon a certification strategy for district manager training for a new product launch. I know that even saying the words product launch are giving some people PTSD tremors. Stay with me here. I promise it'll be worth it. Vanessa will help you. The team was aligned and they worked together like a dream. And they went through the training as they understood that they needed to. And they completed their certification. And together as a team, they rejoiced as all of the district managers passed. And that's not a small thing. That means that the training was successful. And they all knew what they were doing. And then at that point, the training lead heard from his boss, the launch lead, told training that now, all of a sudden, they had to force rank all of the district managers, and 2 of them had to fail and redo their training. I can feel the energy of people watching this, and I can see it in you yourself. When I first heard this story, I was horrified. I was like, why? People have been successful. They did what they were supposed to do. They know the things.
Right.
It feels so arbitrary. It's not for me to judge what that decision was, but the impact of this, the training lead had given in and didn't defend his team, and the team didn't know how to stand up for themselves. And so, I mean, there were some key issues here that I noticed and that I'm sure you've noticed as well. The team felt scared and resentful, but no one knew how to speak out about it. And the leader didn't buffer them by protecting any kind of previous agreements to his boss.
Sure.
So are those the same 2 major issues that you recognize in what could have happened next? And if so, how could team emotional intelligence have helped in this case?
Yeah, this is a tough case. So in this case, there's 2 things really going on, and I'll try to separate them. One is the emotional intelligence of the leader. The leader should have been in tune with how this would affect the emotional world of the team members, and the leader should have really talked to hit the powers that be that were telling him to rank these folks, and refused and been a little bit more assertive and tough about it. But there's also something the team can do, because the team is not a bunch of sitting ducks. So as you recall, one of the aspects of emotionally intelligent teams is that they have a real compact. They have habits about how they treat one another, and they treat one another respectfully. So if the team has a strong sense of emotional intelligence, a strong culture that's supported by these norms in which they care about one another, and they feel that each member belongs, then they would unite and come up against their boss, and they would say, look, this is not the way we operate as a team. If you're going to rank us, then you're certainly breaking our norms. You're breaking the way we like to operate. So they would have that mindset to begin with. The second mindset they'd have is the ability to come together quickly. So in the second bucket, there's this set of norms around how we operate and learn as a team. Well, one of the common norms in that bucket that teams often take on is this ability to stop, reflect, and create a plan about how they're going to deal with issues that come up. And as you know, lots of issues are coming up these days through COVID. And so emotionally intelligent teams are really poised. They have processes in place where they'll do that. So I would say that an emotionally intelligent team in this case would stop, get together, talk together, and figure out how they're going to approach this as a team in a way that's not going to break their norms. And care for one another. I mean, one of the things, we have an innate need in teams to belong, to feel that we're cared about, to feel that among this group of folks, and oftentimes these days folks are changing, but when I'm in this group, I belong and I'm cared about and people are concerned about my needs. We have everyone's back in this team. People thrive in those kinds of teams, and they're not going to let this happen to their team members. Then there's the third bucket, of course, which is the bucket around stakeholders. And they might have been managing these stakeholders if they'd been thinking about it ahead of time. They would have learned more about what was going on with this training program, and they might have anticipated some problems in advance proactively. But mostly, I think what's most powerful here is that an emotionally intelligent team would really balk against this, and an emotionally intelligent leader would balk against this. Why are you doing this? What's the benefit? And not let it happen on their watch. So hopefully that's a good answer to that question.
That was a great answer, and I'm struck by how they really weren't operating as a team.
No, they were not.
They didn't even know what to do. If they had been operating as a team, they would have had a very clear idea of what to do next. It would have already been part of their team DNA. So in this case, we're talking about, in all of these cases, creating inclusive cultures.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm feeling the pain here of exclusion, where you have people who were all together in this beautiful package of a team, and then you purposely exclude two people. That doesn't really have an impact on those two people, does it?
No, and I just want to make a point here that I think is really important, then your listeners will resonate with this. Recent studies showed that 60% of people in organizations today feel somewhat excluded or even ostracized in the teams in which they work. In other words, there are subtle hints that they're not really valued. I mean, that's a rampant problem. And so throughout the research that my colleagues and I have done, including the research that I've done with the folks at Legacy Teams, we've followed teams over time. And we've looked at those teams that are really great. For example, we did a study in a pharma company for drug development teams. And what we found is that in those teams that were at the top of their game, they had each other's backs. No one was ostracized or felt disrespected in those teams. People thrived. They brought their best to the team, and everyone benefited from that. So anyway, that's just an example. I just wanted to remind you that these ideas, the emotional intelligence team model, is rooted in research on what great teams do. And I've seen it over and over again that in great teams, people have each other's backs. They treat each other respectfully.
I think that's a great reminder. We need that, right? Especially when we're stressed out, as people always will be. It's not like there will always be a pandemic, but there will always be some kind of disaster, especially when you're working at breakneck speed on high stakes product launches, and with teams who are made up of very intelligent, very accomplished people who, of course, are all right at the same time. So things are going to come up, and we need to be able to anticipate those in order to move forward. We're not going to have perfect people. That's not going to happen. They're not going to fit perfectly together. We just need to know what's expected of us as a team in order to know that we're behaving appropriately. In that case,
absolutely.
Called out right away, not in a challenging way, you're doing this wrong, but hey, this isn't what we had agreed upon. This isn't us. We have an identity, and this is outside of that. So I think that was a great case study, and I loved your breakdown of that. So thank you for our first one. Moving on to case study number 2, and speaking of teams, as we are for this whole episode, this is called We're on the Same Team. Here's what happened, and stop me if you've heard this before. Those of you who are watching at home, if you can resonate with this, if you can relate to having a disruptive personality or a big ego in the room as you hear this story, type something into the chat so that we know that you get this. If you're watching this at home and you resonate with this, you can even just raise your hand for yourself. And every time you raise your hand in recognition that this has happened to you at some point in your career, that hand raise is a physical reminder for you that one member or more of a team that you were or are a part of could stand to learn a little bit about team emotional intelligence. So let's get into We're on the Same Team. In this case, a company was split into two primary teams, operations and commercialization, with team leads both reporting into the general manager. The operations team lead, from what I'm told by ERS, who provided this case study, he was this political animal, you know the type, out for himself, didn't care who he stepped on as he was trying to get ahead himself, or even for his people, you know, his team. His attitude created this us versus them mentality within his team versus the commercial team and its leader. And then in meetings with the general manager, this operations team lead would go like, teamwork, 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 and it's all about the teamwork, and professing this desire and this high standard for teamwork, never once acting like a team in cooperation and in partnership with the commercial team leader. So she's sitting there trying not to roll her eyes as he's going teamwork, teamwork, teamwork. And behind the general manager's back, he's constantly working actively to make his team look good and the other team look bad. Reminder, this is within one company. They're supposed to be on the same team pursuing the same goals. And so this created, we all know the kind of division that this created, a complete separation between the teams, fostering mistrust and really just a toxic work environment. And meanwhile, the general manager that they both reported into was oblivious. Like, this wasn't happening, couldn't possibly be happening, was blind. Right. It was just so on his goals. He didn't see what was happening until it was too late. And the commercial lead had reached a point where she thought like the company could no longer perform, and felt compelled to go over the general manager's head to shine a light on the dysfunction that was taking place. Also not a great move, right? But at the end of the day, here's what happened. And I'm sure that people in the audience can predict this. If you're watching this at home or in your office, why don't you take a second to just imagine what you think happened? Because I bet you've seen it time and time again. That should probably have been enough time. The end result is that the commercial lead, after being this whistleblower, resigned. The operations lead was fired. And the general manager, who was oblivious, was replaced within 6 months and left the company. So now we have all these people like, I don't know where we're, what's going to be going on, who are our leaders. So what happened here, and how could team emotional intelligence have helped this general manager to get ahead of this disruption before it took over? What could we have seen coming in this case?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and it's so common, right? I mean, not only are your listeners nodding their head and saying, "Yeah, we know those kind of people," but we've all had those kind of people in our organizations and even in our teams. So, in this case, it seems to me like the general manager did not build a team amongst the three of them. So we often think that just by virtue of being in the role, maybe having a shared goal, that people are just going to naturally join and be generous in the way they treat one another. But generosity in a team, which is really necessary, we need to be generous in teams, it doesn't come unless you intentionally create it necessarily. We're all wary. We all, fascinating research looking at, are we technically selfish at our core, or are we technically altruistic at our core? And the answer to that, whether you look at sociobiology, economics, sociology, psychology, the answer is all the same. It depends on the context. We're not dummies. In some contexts, we're selfish to the core because that's the way other people are around us. And in some contexts, we're much more generous. And so what we're trying to do when we build a team is create a context, a culture that is a generous culture. Again, I keep saying we have each other's back and we respect one another. But it doesn't happen naturally because we tend to be wary of it, especially if we're in an organizational culture where that kind of thing, that kind of selfishness, is commonly rewarded, where it is some places. So in this case, what I would say is that general manager who ended up leaving in 6 months, he should have created a leadership team of the three. They should have set norms. They should have said, okay, how are we going to treat one another? What are our shared goals and what's in it for all of us? Sometimes you have to take people who are political animals like that one particular person, and you need to remind them that there's benefit in the team, because when all of our heads are working together, we're much smarter, we're much more capable. Teams, when people are on fire and working together, can solve the most complex of problems. And so you need to recruit that energy, create norms, including one norm in the how we treat one another bucket is addressing unhelpful behavior. So calling it out, and this is what you're working toward in an emotionally intelligent team, is a culture where you can give one another feedback and you can say, hey, look, this doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like you're working towards the goodwill of our team and our organization. And you can bring this up and talk about it. This is not something that happens and everyone pretends it's going to go away. Not in a good team. And so I would say that unfortunately, all this turnover happened. Who knows whether or not those folks who all left really were good people underneath it all. Sometimes there are those egotists that you have to rein in, but let me tell you, I've seen them reined in so often when you build norms and they can actually count on other people having their back. They begin to have other people's backs as well. And I'll tell you, we thrive in teams like that. People crave belonging in teams like that. And the very best teams, you often have superstars in them, people who are egotists. But you show them that when we work together, we all benefit. And it's mutual gain for the whole. And that's what you're aiming at in a culture where we're paying attention to one another's emotions. So hopefully that gives you some ideas.
I have all of the ideas. I'm firing on all of my synapses here. And the word that you just used, thrive, in comparison to, we have Julia Douglas here in our live audience as we're recording this, who said that this case study sounds like an episode of Survivor. I couldn't agree more, right? When you're looking at all of these survivors on that show, none of them look happy. None of them look like that's their first choice, right? There's a prize at the end, but you're miserable fighting for it.
Yes,
and you're miserable when you're pitted against each other and you don't know who to trust. And really, you're not working as a team. You're working in competition against each other. And most of the people on Survivor don't win. Most of them are losers because they don't operate as a team. So thank you, Julia, for calling that out. I was thinking the same thing when I heard this. Like, this is like the animal kingdom. It really is. But humans are animals, and our behavior is just as predictable as theirs. We can track, just as you were saying, that there are people with big egos who've developed them for a reason, because they are the highest performing. They are usually the one who is right in the room. And because they're protecting themselves against a perceived threat that we can't all get ahead at once. And that's a destructive mentality that in creating inclusive cultures with team emotional intelligence can help combat. Also want to take a moment to look at a comment by CEO of Source Explorer, Kellen Barfield, who's called out that silo mentality is a huge issue in life sciences. Do you want to speak to that, Vanessa?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Unless you counteract the silo mentality, you're going to have it. And this is one of the most complicated things, but you can do it. And let me tell you, the great teams do it. A lot of the research that I've done has been with teams, with sort of cross-functional teams, like these drug development teams that we studied. Many teams, cross-cultural teams, people are siloed for a reason. And you have to create a shared goal, which is only one aspect of this. The shared goal alone doesn't do it. The shared norms and culture really makes a difference. And it can break people out of the silo, but you can't pretend the silo is not there. You got to call it out. Again, back to that middle bucket, where as a team, we talk about things. In emotionally intelligent teams, they're not worried to bring up what we call the elephants or the tough issues in the room. And they bring it up over and over again. Sometimes you can't completely wipe out the silo mentality, nor would you want to, because when you're in a team, you're often responsible for your silo. And you got to go back to your home team and you've got to defend your choices. But at the same time, we want you advocating for your silo, but we want you open-minded enough that you're listening to the other issues. And you've got the full team and the full team's mission on your mind, and you contribute to that as well. So you listen, and this happens when you have the norms, when you call it out when it's not happening, and when we give one another feedback when it doesn't happen. And this happens. The norms in great teams support this. And by the way, we don't teach people how to build teams. And one of the things that has become more and more clear to me and many of my colleagues is that too much of our development is focused on individual development, self-awareness, or interpersonal. How do we fix an interpersonal conflict, but not how do we build a team? And let me tell you, building a team is about building a culture. It's about a system of interactions. We lay out what our values, the way we want to do it, and we revisit it over and over and over again. It's an aspiration, and it can be done. Let me say that. It makes a huge difference. So thanks for bringing that up.
These are great questions. We have so many people who are deeply engaged in this conversation live. We have our show going live on LinkedIn as well as on YouTube. And some people are watching this on the recording or are on team replay watching it later. You're all welcome to this conversation. If you're just joining us, I want to underscore what I'm feeling is a common theme here, that these, what you're calling norms, or they're expectations, things we expect of each other. We know how to act because we've already agreed upon it in any situation. So it makes it not just about, oh no, we have one guy with a big ego, what do we do now? It's not about those one-offs. It's about all of the one-offs, all of the things that can pop up, because we know what's expected of anyone, and we hold each other accountable when we have inclusive cultures created by team emotional intelligence.
Yes, and let me say something about that. This inclusive culture requires that you don't allow the one person in the room to take up all the space. And there will always be people who try to do that. And if that's happening in your team, it's because your norms allow it to happen. Behavior is not random. There are always norms. In any environment that we're in, there are norms. And whether or not you bring them up and you look at them and you say, are these norms serving us well? How should we change them? And they can change, and they can change quickly. Norms can change quickly if everyone agrees they need to change, but it doesn't happen without some work, right? So if you agree that the person in the room can't this sort of aggressive, dominant, maybe the star in the room is talking too much, then we have to agree that we are going to stop it when it happens, and we're going to put that person's comments in a parking lot somewhere, come back to them, not miss them because they might be important, but it's dampening down everyone else being at their best. In great teams, you feel like you're on fire, people, the reason I got interested in teams is because there were so many differences among teams that I was part of. In some teams, I would just be so smart. And in some teams, I was so dumb. And I said, what's the difference here? And so it's really about the culture in the team and whether or not people value you, et cetera, all these norms that we're talking about. So,
because of course, I think we can all sufficiently tell you're not dumb in any team. That's not the reality. You're not dumb in any room. I'm sure you've never been dumb a day in your life. But to feel that way, I've been there. I've been there too. I'm still hearing this thing you just said about, the one disruptive person, or that the one person who has the need for more credit or greater attention, that within these inclusive cultures, you're including everybody equally, and that person's voice doesn't get greater weight. So this isn't only applicable within a team that you manage, is it? I'm thinking about a scenario where you have a training event going on, and
Right.
one or two people are pulling focus for whatever reason. Either they're completely disengaged and not willing, or they are talking more because they feel they know more, or they are
Right.
the star, and how could you teach me anything? Raise your hand at home again if you know that person. Raise your hand if you are that person and you have felt that you are in the wrong room and that no one there can teach you anything. I bet we have both kinds watching this video right now, so be honest. But in those environments where you let one or two people pull focus from the entire room who's trying to learn something, you've done a disservice to everybody, including those two people. So team emotional intelligence is applicable there as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. So let me just say a little bit about this. First of all, those people, they can be your worst enemies in a team, but they also can be your best assets. And so there's a little bit of a need to figure out what's really going on here. Sometimes these people who are really jerks, they're sometimes the canary in the mine that notices something wrong in the norms, and they notice it first. And they keep trying to get in there and trying to make change or trying to get heard. It turns out when we feel like things are wrong, we sometimes lose our self-control. And that happens to a lot of these jerks. They're not really jerks underneath. And the reason I say this is because I've seen it happen so often. There's one in every team, someone who's either a canary in the mine that's calling out something and saying, hey, something's not working well. Can we please revisit our norms? Or there's someone who needs to really maybe not even get invited to the meeting, or it needs to be managed through norms as well. So don't be too quick to judge someone who's a deviant as someone who is really all out for themselves. Because what I've seen happen is when you create these emotional intelligence norms, sometimes those people who were the jerks end up being the most helpful person in the team. And so when you feel like you have an outlet, for example, that middle bucket, where we all get to chime in on what's going well, what's not going well in the team, and what we need to change. When they have the opportunity to do that, they can sometimes come into their own, oftentimes come into their own, and really be constructive rather than hurtful. So just a thought.
Thank you for going into that more. I'm really glad that you did take the time, because this is such a rich subject and so many people are already at home relating and processing, and there's so much to go into, isn't there? We could talk about this probably forever.
Be fun for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much
stuff
that we can learn from you. Certainly you've spent so much time researching this. Passion for this topic has driven you to write and write and write. I think you're writing a book now, aren't you?
I am. So I've spent years studying teams, and I spent years working with teams out in the field all over the world. And so right now I'm writing a book on how to build an emotionally intelligent team. So I'll be excited to share that with you. Maybe I'll come back on here, Elida, and we'll talk about the book when it's out. How's that sound?
I would love it. Sign me up for a pre-order of the first copy, especially if it's signed. Yeah. So let's move on to our final case of the three, because we've got some really great questions too that I want to examine if we have time. So case 3, provided again by our episode sponsor, ERS, Educational Resource Systems, is cross-boundary loyalties, or what you've been referring to as stakeholder management. So here's what happened. A client continually missed deadlines and reversed feedback on a project, which caused the vendor's production team stress and anxiety, obviously. And the client's approach was that this vendor should just do what they were told, regardless of his inability to manage his side, his unwillingness to care about how his behavior was impacting the vendor's project team. And it just created a lot of mess, a lot of undue anxiety within this vendor's production team. It led to finger pointing, breakdown of team cohesion. And I'm sure that everybody out there who's ever had to work with a vendor, or who has been a vendor or a supplier like myself, you run up against these challenges all the time when you are actually on different teams at different companies, but you're trying to serve the same goals. So what could team emotional intelligence have done to help unite the vendor and the client as maybe one team? Is that possible, to have a feeling of one team rather than an us versus them, and they'll just take my orders? Is that even possible?
So yeah, this brings up a lot of memories in my mind of working with teams where this kind of thing happens. So it's really common when you've got two groups that are interacting together that have different identities to sort of clash in the way they view an issue. And the bucket of norms that addresses this is really, like you said, Lila, the stakeholder management bucket. And so in this bucket, the way it works is that teams create what's called a stakeholder management plan, and people in the team are responsible for talking with various stakeholders and finding out what's going on in the emotional world of those stakeholders. So really finding out what the issues are, and then bringing that back to the team, which enables the team to work much better with that stakeholder. So whether it's your boss or whether it's a vendor or whether it's a client, if someone is focusing on that relationship, on understanding that world, and on building that relationship, it makes for much less conflictual interactions. And it's really common to have problems with stakeholders, and it's really common to create stories around these stakeholders and attribute motives to what's going on with those folks. And one of my favorite sayings right now is different stories, different emotions. So you can create the story about your stakeholder that they're just ignoring you, or they don't understand, or how could they do this to me? Or you could say another story, because obviously that story makes you feel angry, right? Makes you feel angry, anxious. Here's another story. What about they are overwhelmed and they need your support? And there's a lot going on for them that we don't even know is going on. And if we understood it, the relationship could be much better. So that's just another way of reframing. One of the skills in emotional intelligence, individual emotional intelligence, is this self-management skill. I was talking about earlier about, do I frame my emotions right now as anxiety? Here I am being interviewed by the eloquent Lila, or do I frame it as excitement? A different story, different emotions. And we often have to do this with our stakeholders or with other groups. There's just so many examples of this. So I would say lean on that external boundary, that stakeholder bucket of norms, and bring that information back to the way we learn and develop as a team, and bring it in and say, what are we going to do? How are we going to address this? Can we bring individuals? Can we send someone over there to the other side to learn more about how we can make this relationship work more effectively? And if you do that mindfully, it will have some difference anyway.
It must. Certainly if you begin with a shared mission, and maybe by including that client on your team, if you're the vendor, as you often are and I often am, by including that client on our team from the beginning and getting on the same page about that shared mission. Can you speak to what impact just that one piece might have?
The shared mission. Oh yeah. Smart point to bring up here, Lila. So, it's well and good to have these norms and the three buckets of norms, but there are actually three fundamentals. We call them fundamentals because they're foundational for any team. One is you have got to have a very clear shared mission, very clear shared goal that everybody buys into. And this is no small thing. It takes work. If you don't have this in place, then the norms don't do you much good. This is the kind of shared mission that can help people get out of their silos, that can help them see why they need to get out of their silos. And the problem with this is it's often a moving target. In research that we've done, especially in pharma companies, we found that this is always a moving target. And so you come back to it constantly and you remind people of it. So that's the shared mission. The second one is good meeting processes. So is everyone heard in our meetings? You know, when you're meeting with your stakeholder, you know, do you have a good agenda? Are you making sure that this is a back and forth? You're advocating for your view and you're feeling empathy for their view. So good meeting processes. And then the third fundamental is everybody's clear on what their role is and expectations for those roles. And so those three foundational elements, if you've got problems, if you're in a team where role expectations aren't clear, you really want to address that. And even make it clear, not just what my role is, but what's your role, and how do we support one another in those roles. So anyway, shared mission, absolutely critical. But it won't alone, it won't make you a great team. It's the culture that builds the camaraderie that makes you better than the sum of your parts, as they say. You know, the best teams are, you know, I bring my skills to it, but you bring out the best in me when I'm thriving. And again, it's a moving target. You know, I don't want to be a Pollyanna-ish about this. You know, all teams are up and down, up and down, up and down. But what you really want to aim at is a team that can come up when it needs to, and it can and people can thrive and be their best. And anyway, that's part of your culture.
In that environment where you already have a shared mission and you have a culture where you know that that's important and you've created it on purpose, can you speak to the importance of just having clear goals? Just clear goals for people, because the target does keep moving, right? So as it does, the clarity you once have is then lost. You have this clarity, you know what everyone is supposed to do, and then something changes, which is frequently why the client might be reaching out and saying, wait, this is now a bigger priority. Something has changed for us, and now we need to much more heavily lean into this one point, and we need your support on that. And they feel this urgency around it. So can you just speak to the importance of clear goals for a moment here?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, so the mission is really, what's the overarching thing? What are we aiming at? What's the big picture? And the goals are the pieces that help us get to that mission. And so again, so perhaps what I should have said is that the goals are a moving target. Let's keep the mission in place. Yeah, I mean, what I always advocate for with teams is that we're really clear, not just on the goal that's in front of us right now and how that might have moved, but also what's the goal of this meeting that we're in? What's the point of this meeting? Are we sharing information today? Are we making a decision? Are we all going to be interacting? You know, who needs to be here for that? What is the goal in the meeting? What is the goal? People can feel much more empowered and influential when it's clear what the goal is. It's very basic. You know, I often interview team leaders and I say, well, is the goal clear? And they almost always say, oh yeah, of course the goal is clear. What kind of leader do you think I am? And then I go and I interview the team members and they say, well, I think I know what the goal is. It's not really all that clear. And so what I would just say is, if you're a team leader, you have got to assume that the goal is not as clear as you think it is. It's clear for you, make it clear for others. And that empowers people. That empowers them to behave at their best.
I'm so glad that you called out the importance of having a clear goal for a meeting. If you're watching this at home, raise your hand if you've ever sat in a meeting, and you can go ahead and raise your hand with me, Vanessa, because I know you've been in meetings that could have been an email.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes.
Raise your hand if you've been in a meeting that you didn't actually need to be at, and it was only those people, and you just were there as collateral, or as a person that someone else knew would help them and back them up on one point as they opposed someone else, and that's your whole purpose for being there. So when you really are accountable to respecting people and their time, having a clear goal for that meeting is so important, and I'm very grateful that you brought that up. I hope everyone watching considers that next time you plan a meeting. Wouldn't that be nice? Okay, so we have gone through 3 great case studies here, and by great I mean horrible, because these situations could have been avoided.
Yeah, realistic.
This is not new stuff. We're not talking about all of a sudden in the year 2020 or 2021, even later, you know, that we all of a sudden have people with big egos. We're not thinking all of a sudden that there's going to be an us versus them mentality. This is not new. Human behavior is not new. The industries that we are all working in are mostly not new. So what is new here is this idea that you can predict human behavior and plan for it using team emotional intelligence.
And
reinforcing for myself
about that. One more quick thing
Yes.
about that, Lila, because the other thing that's new is all the brain research that's coming out now. You know, I have, for example, an undergraduate degree from Indiana University, from the psychology department. That department is now called the Department of Brain and Behavioral Sciences. So much research has been done on the brain right now. And much of that research, a whole field of neuroscience right now is called social neuroscience. And it looks at the emotional needs that people have and how that affects their performance and their behavior. And so what we know now that we didn't know before was the extent of people's social needs, the extent of their need to be included and feel like they belong. And when they don't feel like they're valued and they belong in the team and they have some sense of influence there, they are not at their best. And so what's important now is that we realize people aren't even aware of many of these needs. I could tell you stories about research about how you warn people something's going to happen and they say, oh yeah, that doesn't matter to me. I don't need people. I'm independent. And then you get in and they've got you wired up underneath an MRI machine. And as soon as someone looks at you askance, as if you don't know what you're talking about, boom, your whole entire brain is light up with anxiety. That's the kind of thing that happens in so many teams. And the emotional impact that we have on one another is there in order to save our lives. And we have large brains for social reasons. We pick up on every clue. If you pick up your phone every time I talk, you check your messages when I talk, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be at my best. And so we now know that we can set norms and we can build a culture that addresses these emotional needs. We now know that leaders need to have emotional intelligence so that they can recognize when there have been violations of needs and that are going to keep people from performing at their best. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. Let you come back and maybe we've got some more questions from your audience that we can address in the time that we have.
Oh, wait, we've gotten so much out of you. This has just been gold. And with the 3 case studies, I think it really illustrates your points here that we can absolutely predict the ways that things might go off the rails because we're working with people and people are predictable. So by simply having some expectations set up ahead of time about those 3 buckets that you mentioned, which are how we treat each other, how we operate and learn as a team, and what we can expect and how we treat our stakeholders, how we engage our stakeholders. So with those 3 buckets in mind, we should be able to set up clear expectations for what our culture is like. So since we've gotten so much value out of you already, I have a few questions, if you don't mind just taking a few more from the audience, because we've got some doozies here. And I want to make sure that we get every last drop of Vanessa Druskat here that we can get. So one question here, it says, non-courageous leaders typically don't deal with poor performers, would rather be liked by all than rock the boat. Is this a case in which team emotional intelligence can help that leader find backbone and be a more effective leader?
Yes. So this is actually one of the more difficult issues. It's when the leaders is problematic. Team members can get together in order to change a norm in a team, to change the norms. What it requires is some connection among people, a connection among the team members, and deciding, do we want this to continue or can we change this together? And so once you get agreement, basically norms are, expectations, and stronger norms are when we agree on those expectations. And so if we can question, what is our norm here? You can bring this up in a meeting. Is this the way we do things? Are we going to pick up our phones during meetings? Are we gonna, for example, I have a colleague whose meetings, everybody brings their computer and types on their computer during the meetings. And the norm is, if you're not working on your computer during the meeting, that you don't have enough work to do. Okay, so someone's got to call that out, and someone's got to support them. Change happens when someone's willing to call it out, and other people in the team support that need. And that's the kind of thing that can happen, that can change the norms in the team, and sort of do a workaround around the leader.
That answers the next question that we had too, I think, which was from an audience member asking, how can team members hold leaders accountable for team emotional intelligence when everybody has agreed here's what it is? What if it's the leader who's on his or her phone in the meeting and scrolling? In this case, having this culture set up ahead of time might embolden people who don't want to rock that boat, right? So even when you're managing up, when you're dealing with the problem above you and the problem is the leader, that you all as a team, maybe you have something fun to say, make a game out of it and say, phone, put a $10,000 in the donation bucket or something, make it high stakes. There are all kinds of ways that people can lighten the atmosphere while still holding each other accountable.
Yes, and it's particularly helpful if you've got people set up to agree with you. You don't want to be the one out on the limb all by yourself, and people are turning their heads the other way. You can. You have the power. You should never feel you don't have the power. Small changes have big impact. One of the things I've learned is that these don't have to be big changes. Small changes that can have a huge impact on the way a team works.
We have a question. Can you summarize what leaders can do regarding emotional intelligence to create a strong and effective team? So some actions that maybe those watching can take away with us right now.
You bet. So the biggest thing you can do is sit down with your team, and now's the perfect time to do it during the pandemic. It's really a great time to reboot. People have needs that they didn't have before, and just basically say, okay, what I want to do is I want to revisit what our team culture looks like. Let's get intentional about how we behave with one another and how we work together as a team. What's working, what's not working. Let's have an open conversation. I'm bringing this elephant in the room so that you can feel like you can say anything that's on your mind. Let's set some ground rules, that everybody gets to talk, everybody's heard, some basic things, and then basically do what I often refer to as a plus delta, which is what's working well, start with that, and then what do we need to change? What do we want to have happen? And then what I like to do is, I don't think this all has to be on the back of the leader. What I like to do is I like to assign, when you come up with a change that you want to have happen, I like to assign them to a couple of team members, a lead and someone to help, and say, okay, if one of our norms is that we want to get to know one another a little bit better, which by the way is a very powerful norm, it's directly linked to performance in teams. If you don't know the people in your team, you don't know something about them, then you rarely can trust them. And we connect and we build trust and we begin to have each other's back, and we stop making negative judgments about people when we peel away and we get to know. For example, what's your favorite thing about your job? What's your least favorite thing about your job? These kinds of things. So anyway, you assign this to team members, and you have the team members say, okay, I'm in charge of this norm. I'm going to figure out how we're going to develop that. I'll bring back some ideas to you, and you can tell me if you like them. Come up with each of those new norms you want to have, assign them to the team members, and help the team members help you institute and regularize those new norms, and intentionally create an environment where you figure out how you're going to treat one another, how you're going to learn and work together as a team, and how you're going to treat your stakeholders.
Well, you've said my favorite word, which is intention and intentionally. And I love the example you gave. Honestly, Vanessa, I think that if people who are watching this only take away one thing, and it's this last piece of actionable advice from you, they could completely transform the way that they do business together as a team, where everybody has a feeling that they belong that they're important,
Yes.
that they have
Yes.
a role, that they have a contribution, and that those contributions will lead to a result that doesn't only benefit them, but benefits everybody on their team, the entire
Right.
company. And especially because we're talking mostly about life sciences here, the good work ultimately leads to greater patient outcomes, helping the people who need the services provided by these companies, these products.
Absolutely.
This is very important work. It's vital.
Yes.
So it is very high stakes. These are
very high stakes.
more than many. So I want to thank everybody for watching with us. I know that there are additional questions. Do you have time for just one more?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. This question is from Betty Rothbart, who happens to be my mother. So if I didn't take her question, I'd be in trouble. She asks, any thoughts, Vanessa, about how to get team members to articulate goals so that the team manager can check them out without embarrassing anyone? Getting the team members to articulate the goals so that the team manager can make sure they understand them, I think, without putting anybody on the spot.
Sure. So what I would do is, here's a great way to do that. So you have people send in these goals. I'm not sure I exactly understand the question, but let me say this. Here's a great way to do it. Have everyone, type down these goals, send them into the leader. You don't have to have anybody's specific name attached to any of these. And then, create a list and then send it back to the team. One of the things that I often do, I mean, in face-to-face, is I'll just use 3x5 cards and I'll have someone put something down on a card, something that they really like that's happening and something that they want to change, goal or something. And then I shuffle them all up and I have other people read them so that people feel like they can say what's really on their mind. It's so important that people feel like they can say what's on their mind, articulate their goal without feeling judged for it. And it takes a while to build that kind of culture. But you will build that kind of culture if it is something that you want to do. And it starts by just once in a while noticing the benefit of getting people's real goals out and not just that they're nodding their head and going along to get along. Hopefully that helps.
I think that's great. And it sounds really fun too, right? Like, let's make a game of this and make sure that it's like the game of telephone almost, where it's almost funny if you get it wrong, except it's not funny because you don't have a lot of time, but it's a fast game. So I love that. And it's a great way to keep people anonymous while you still need it, maybe in that transition period. But please correct me if I'm not understanding this correctly. But I think that the real goal is to get people to a point where they can speak out loud comfortably and say, I don't think I get this. Yes. Or to say something that isn't the right thing and create a culture where they will never be made to feel embarrassed, that they can be wrong in a safe space and that the correction will not embarrass them, but rather make them feel valued for having brought up an opportunity to become more clear.
Yes. It's so critical. One of the norms in our middle bucket there, how we learn and develop as a team, is called support expression. And it's basically a recognition that you have to make it easy for people to bring up things that are uncomfortable. And there are lots of ways to do this. Like I mentioned, the elephant in the room, just by virtue of putting that elephant there and saying, look, we want to bring up your elephants. We want you to do that, or coming up with ways, anything that can make it easier for people, especially in the beginning, to do this stuff. And then it does. Once people find out that this is helping the team, and I'll tell you, you want to bring these conversations in the room. If they're not happening in the room, they're happening in the hallways. They're happening behind closed doors, and everyone wants to have it in the team. And so the team leader is important in this respect, to role model the ability to hear this stuff without, turn it into from anxiety into excitement. There's my favorite one. Because this isn't easy for a team leader to hear. Team leaders take it personally when often they do, they prefer to just have their head in the sand sometimes and think, oh, let's go, everything's fine, it's all going to be fine. And when they start digging up, honest comments and what's really, they somehow getting the other side of that, it really requires a level of self-management and recognizing that the purpose of the team is to think better together. It's to be more than the sum of your parts. And it's Again, back to the neuroscience. It's not comfortable. It's not comfortable for the leader. Let's recognize that. But it's also not comfortable for the members to speak out and potentially harm relationships or to say something that's in their way. We have to make it easier, and we have to thank people for bringing it up. Anyway, hopefully
I'm glad you brought up this. No, I'm so with you here. I'm glad that you brought up the discomfort too, because we value discomfort when it comes to growth and stretching and finding ways to improve our performance. But you don't want your discomfort to be spent on something that could have been avoided. You want your discomfort to be in the stretch, the growth that benefits everybody, that really will have the greatest return.
Yeah, it's such, two things that differentiate these top teams. They have a culture that supports generosity amongst one another, but that also generates a growth mindset. This is all, it's all in a wild experiment. We're doing our best. We want to grow. We want to continually get better. That mindset, it really differentiates top teams from the average team. Most teams are average.
Well, I think you've brought up the average for all of us here today. You've certainly brought it up for me. I don't know that I'm now an expert on team emotional intelligence, but I certainly know that when I see something that I've seen before, whether it's in a different company or the same one, oh, here we go again. Whenever I feel that, oh, here we go again, that's an example of a time when team emotional intelligence could have helped us avoid those solutions by creating a culture in which the elephants in the room are not only addressed, but are embraced as opportunities to come closer together. So I've gotten a ton out of this. I think our audience has as well. I don't want to keep you any longer, but I appreciate you and your time so much. Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you to our episode sponsor, Educational Resource Systems, ERS. If you want to check out their work, hire Vanessa and ERS to come in and do a workshop or training on team emotional intelligence in your workplace. Go to educationalresource.com. Thank you again so much, and thank you to all of you who have tuned in to watch.
Thank you, Lila. It's been a great pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here. Take good care.